Welcome to Dreadory. Tonight we bring you 9 true stories from Alaska's most isolated towns, where people battle not only the freezing winds and endless nights, but also fears they can't explain. These are real experiences, seen, lived, and endured by those who can never forget them. To protect their privacy, some names and places have been changed, but the terror and the pain remain just as real. Before we begin, I have one small request. If you connect with these stories, please support me by subscribing. Your support is what gives me the strength to bring you true horror stories every single day. Now let's step into our first chilling tale.
I am telling you this because Cold Bay is not on most maps, and maybe that is for the best. Population 108 on a good day, perched on the edge of the Aleutian Peninsula, where the wind never stops and the fog rolls in like a living thing. Most people pass through on their way to somewhere else, but I have been guiding fishing trips out of Cold Bay for 12 years. I know every inlet, every current, and every face that belongs in this place. That is why I noticed when people started disappearing. It began in late May, when the salmon runs were just starting to build. I had taken a group of 4 executives from Seattle out for a 3-day charter, corporate types who paid premium rates to catch fish they would never eat and take photos they would post once before forgetting. The kind of clients who kept my operation running through the lean months. Jake Morrison was their point man, a vice president at some tech company who wore expensive rain gear that had never seen real weather. He talked big about landing a 50-pound king and tipped well enough that I ignored his city attitude. We launched before dawn on a Tuesday, heading out through the channel toward the fishing grounds near Thin Point. The water was glass calm, unusual for that stretch, and the clients were excited about the conditions. Morrison kept checking his phone even though we were well outside any cell coverage. That should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Nobody checks a dead phone that often, unless they are expecting trouble. The fishing was exceptional that first day. We pulled in limits of silver salmon and 2 respectable kings. The clients were happy, snapping photos, and already planning their next trip. We anchored in a protected cove for lunch, and that is when Morrison started asking questions that did not sit right. He wanted to know about the local population, who lived year-round versus seasonal workers, whether people kept track of comings and goings. I told him what everyone knows. Cold Bay is small enough that you notice when someone is missing from the grocery store or the post office. People look out for each other because there's nobody else to do it. Morrison nodded like he was filing the information away. He asked about the airstrip, how often planes came through, whether there was regular cargo service. I explained that the airport was left over from World War II, built when Cold Bay was a major military staging area. These days, it mostly served charter flights and the occasional supply run. The runway could handle jets, but most traffic was small planes serving the fishing lodges and research stations scattered around the peninsula. That evening back at the harbor, I helped them clean their catch and store it in the lodge freezer. Morrison lingered after the others went inside, asking more questions. He wanted to know about law enforcement, how long it would take for help to arrive if there was trouble, whether the state troopers made regular patrols. I told him the nearest trooper post was in King Salmon, 300 miles away. Cold Bay was essentially self-policing, which worked fine because serious crime was rare. People had enough real problems with weather and isolation without creating more. The second day started rough. The wind had picked up overnight, and the seas were running 4 to 6 feet. I suggested postponing until conditions improved, but Morrison insisted on going out. He said they had a schedule to keep and could handle a little chop. We made it to the fishing grounds, but the clients spent more time hanging over the rail than working their lines. By noon, I called it and headed back to harbor. That afternoon, while the clients rested, I walked over to the store to pick up supplies. Emma Patterson, who ran the place, mentioned that the Kowalski family had left town suddenly the week before. Tom Kowalski worked seasonal maintenance at the airport and usually stayed through summer. Emma said they packed up in the middle of the night and caught a charter flight out without saying goodbye to anyone. She thought it was strange because Tom had talked about his kids starting school in Cold Bay that fall. I asked around and found 2 other families had left recently, under similar circumstances. The Hendersons, who ran a small bed and breakfast, and the Williamses, who operated a guide service competing with mine. In each case, they had departed quickly and quietly, leaving behind property and commitments. The pattern felt wrong. Cold Bay might be isolated, but people did not just vanish without explanation. The 3rd day with Morrison's group was when everything changed. We launched early and headed toward Mortenson's Lagoon, a productive area I had been saving for their final day. The weather was perfect, light winds and unlimited visibility. We were setting up over a promising ledge when Morrison received a radio call on a frequency I did not recognize. The conversation was brief and coded, but I caught enough to understand they were discussing pickup times and passenger counts. Morrison noticed my attention and smiled that cold corporate smile. He asked if I had ever considered expanding my operation, maybe taking on some specialized charter work that would pay significantly better than fishing trips. I said I was happy with my current business model. He nodded and made a note in a small book he carried. That is when I realized the fishing trip was never about fishing. Over the following weeks, more people left Cold Bay. The departures accelerated, always happening at night, always involving charter flights from the airport. The remaining residents were nervous, but nobody wanted to voice their suspicions out loud. Small towns survive on trust, and once that breaks down, the community dies. I started paying attention to flight schedules and noticed a pattern. Charter planes were arriving every few days, usually late evening or early morning. The manifest listed passengers outbound but rarely showed anyone arriving. The planes were using call signs I did not recognize and filing flight plans to destinations outside Alaska. Something was using Cold Bay as a way station for moving people who did not want to be tracked. The breakthrough came in August when I was fueling my boat at the harbor. A charter flight had arrived that morning, and I watched the passengers disembark. They moved like people who had been traveling for days, carrying small bags, and wearing clothes that did not match the weather. Most disturbing were their faces. They looked like people who had given up hope. I followed the group at a distance as they were loaded into vans and driven to a warehouse near the airport. The building had been empty for years, but I could see lights inside and hear the sound of generators running. I circled around back and found a window that gave me a view of the interior. What I saw made my blood freeze. The warehouse had been converted into holding cells. Dozens of people were crowded into makeshift enclosures, men and women of various ages, all looking exhausted and terrified. Armed guards patrolled the space, and I recognized some of the missing Cold Bay residents among them. They were not victims. They were part of the operation. I backed away carefully and returned to town, my mind racing. Cold Bay was being used as a transit point for human trafficking. The isolated location, the military-grade runway, and the lack of law enforcement made it perfect for moving people without detection. The operation had recruited local residents to provide cover and logistic support. Those who refused to cooperate were eliminated or forced to leave. I knew I had to act, but I also knew that making accusations without proof would likely get me killed. I started documenting everything: flight schedules, vehicle movements, personnel changes. I installed a small camera near the warehouse and began collecting evidence. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and well-funded. Planes arrived from the lower 48 carrying human cargo. The victims were processed through the warehouse facility, then loaded onto different aircraft bound for international destinations. The local participants were carefully selected. Tom Kowalski, who worked at the airport, could manipulate flight records and provide access to restricted areas. The Hendersons, with their hospitality business, could house operation personnel without drawing attention. Other residents provided transportation, communications, and security services. The network had been built systematically over several years. My investigation lasted 3 months before I was discovered. I returned to my boat one evening to find Morrison waiting in the cabin. He was not alone. 2 men with the look of professional security flanked him, and I could see others positioned around the harbor. Morrison complimented my thoroughness and said the organization was impressed with my investigative skills. He offered me a choice: join the operation as a marine transport coordinator, or disappear like the others who had refused. I told him I needed time to consider the offer. He gave me 24 hours to decide and warned that attempting to contact outside authorities would be considered a hostile act. After they left, I gathered the evidence I had collected and prepared for the most dangerous gamble of my life. That night, I loaded my boat with supplies and headed out toward the fishing grounds. Instead of stopping, I continued east toward the Alaska Peninsula mainland. I had cached emergency gear at several remote locations over the years, and I used that network to stay ahead of the search that I knew would follow. It took me 6 days of island hopping and night travel to reach a commercial fishing fleet operating near Kodiak. The captain of a crab boat agreed to relay a message to the Coast Guard, and within hours, I was aboard a cutter heading back toward Cold Bay. The raid happened 3 days later. Federal agents found the warehouse empty, but the evidence I had gathered led to arrests across multiple states. The operation had been dismantled, but most of the key players had escaped. I never returned to Cold Bay. The town still exists, but the population has dropped to fewer than 50 permanent residents. The airport still operates, but charter traffic has declined significantly. Sometimes I wonder about the people who were processed through that warehouse, where they ended up, whether any of them made it home. The lesson I learned is simple. Isolation can be a weapon as much as a refuge. In places like Cold Bay, where help is hundreds of miles away and winter can cut you off from the world for months, predators operate with impunity. The very remoteness that draws people seeking peace and solitude also attracts those who prey on the vulnerable. If you find yourself in a small Alaskan community and notice people disappearing, trust your instincts. Document what you see. Contact outside authorities even if local law enforcement seems uninterested. Remember that in places where everyone knows everyone, the greatest danger often comes from the people you trust most. Cold Bay taught me that monsters are real, but they do not lurk in the wilderness. They operate businesses, hold positions of authority, and smile while they destroy lives. The most disturbing truth about that place is not what happened there, but how easily it could happen again in any isolated community where people value privacy over scrutiny and trust over verification. I am Sarah Brennan, and I have been conducting geological surveys in Alaska for 8 years. I understand soil composition, frost heave, and thermal dynamics better than most people understand their morning coffee routine. What I found beneath Talkeetna in September defied every principle of ground science I had ever learned. The town hired me to investigate foundation problems that had been getting worse over the past 3 summers. Buildings were shifting, basements were flooding, and the main street had developed a series of sinkholes that kept reappearing no matter how many times the city filled them. The mayor, a practical woman named Janet Phillips, said they needed answers before the tourist season brought liability issues they could not afford. Talkeetna sits at the confluence of 3 rivers, about 2 hours north of Anchorage. Population 876, most of whom make their living from the climbers heading to Denali, or the tourists who come for the small-town charm. It is the kind of place where everyone knows your business but minds their own, where the post office doubles as a social center and the general store extends credit based on handshakes. I started with standard soil boring tests around the affected areas. The equipment should have hit permafrost at 18 to 24 inches, consistent with regional patterns. Instead, I found loose soil and pockets of air that extended much deeper than expected. The temperature readings were wrong, too. The ground should have been frozen solid at depth, but my instruments showed temperatures well above freezing in areas that had never seen summer thaw. The boring samples contained organic material that did not belong, plant matter and wood fragments that appeared to be decades old, mixed with soil that showed clear signs of human disturbance. I found fabric scraps, metal fragments, and what looked like bone chips scattered through the samples. The material was not randomly distributed. It formed distinct layers, as if someone had buried multiple loads of mixed debris over an extended period. I expanded the survey area and discovered the soil anomalies followed a specific pattern beneath the town. The affected zones formed a rough grid, like a network of passages running under the buildings. I requested permission to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys, explaining that we might be dealing with natural caverns or old mining tunnels that were causing the structural problems. The radar results changed everything. Beneath Talkeetna was an extensive network of artificial tunnels, hand-carved through the permafrost and extending in multiple directions from a central hub located under the Historical Society building. The passages were roughly 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, clearly designed for human use. Some extended beyond the town limits, disappearing under the forest in directions that led toward the river systems. I presented my preliminary findings to the City Council and recommended bringing in specialists to map the tunnel system before attempting any repairs. The council members exchanged glances that suggested they knew more than they were saying. Janet Phillips asked me to keep the discovery confidential while they consulted with state authorities about the best way to proceed. That night, I received a call from Ellen Morrison, the Historical Society director. She asked me to meet her at the museum after hours, saying she had information that might explain what I had found. I arrived at 8:30 and found Ellen waiting with a collection of documents spread across a large table. The papers were town records dating back to 1918, the year the Spanish flu pandemic reached interior Alaska. Ellen explained that Talkeetna had been hit particularly hard, losing nearly 40% of its population in the span of 3 months. The official death toll was 68 people, but Ellen believed the actual number was much higher. According to the documents, the town had faced a crisis in disposing of the bodies. The ground was frozen too hard for normal burial, and the volume of deaths had overwhelmed the small cemetery. A group of residents led by a man named Thomas Kowalski had proposed an alternative solution. They would excavate storage chambers in the permafrost beneath the town, creating a temporary repository until spring, allowed for proper interment. The excavation began in November 1918 and continued through the winter. The work was done in secret to avoid panic among the surviving residents. Bodies were lowered through access points disguised as root cellars and storage areas, then arranged in the chambers that had been carved from the frozen ground. The plan was to retrieve them for burial once the spring thaw made cemetery work possible. Ellen showed me a hand-drawn map that depicted the tunnel system exactly as my radar had revealed it. The chambers were designed to preserve the bodies in the natural refrigeration of the permafrost until proper burial could be arranged. But spring 1919 brought new problems. Many of the excavation workers had died during the winter, and the surviving residents wanted nothing to do with the grim task of body retrieval. The access points were sealed, and the tunnels abandoned. Over the decades, the location of the chambers had been forgotten. Town records made vague references to a temporary cemetery, but the details had been deliberately obscured. Ellen said only a few families retained knowledge of what lay beneath their feet, and they had kept the secret for generations. I asked why she was telling me this now, and Ellen's expression grew troubled. She said the recent ground thaw was not just affecting building foundations. The permafrost that had preserved the bodies for over a century was melting, and things were stirring down there. Residents had been reporting strange sounds at night, voices coming from basement walls, and the smell of decay that seemed to rise from cracks in the ground. The next morning, I returned to the survey sites with different equipment. I used acoustic sensors to detect movement in the tunnels, and the results were disturbing. The chambers showed clear signs of activity. Something was moving through the passages, creating vibrations that registered on my instruments in patterns that suggested organized behavior rather than random settling. I convinced the city council to allow me to open one of the sealed access points. We chose a location behind the hardware store where the radar showed a junction of several passages. The work required excavating through 4 feet of soil and debris to reach a wooden hatch that had been built into a concrete frame. When we lifted the hatch, the smell that rose from below was overwhelming. Not the clean scent of preserved bodies, but the thick, sweet odor of active decay. I lowered a camera into the opening and immediately saw that we were dealing with something far worse than forgotten graves. The bodies in the chambers were not lying peacefully where they had been placed. They had been moved, arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate organization. Some were stacked in corners, others laid out in rows that extended beyond the range of my camera light. The preservation was uneven. Some remains were perfectly intact, while others showed advanced decomposition that should have been impossible in the frozen environment. Most disturbing were the signs of recent activity. Footprints in the soil floor, drag marks where bodies had been repositioned, and what appeared to be primitive tools left scattered around the chambers. Someone or something had been working in the tunnels, organizing and rearranging the contents according to some incomprehensible system. I contacted the state medical examiner and requested an immediate investigation. Within 2 days, a team of forensic specialists arrived in Talkeetna, along with state troopers and representatives from the health department. The investigation was conducted under strict security, but word of the discovery spread quickly through the small community. The forensic team spent a week mapping and documenting the tunnel system. They found remains of over 200 individuals, far more than the historical records indicated. The preservation varied dramatically between chambers, with some bodies appearing almost fresh, while others had decomposed completely. The team could not explain the inconsistent conditions or the evidence of recent disturbance. More troubling were the additional tunnels they discovered. The original 1918 excavation had been expanded over the decades, with new passages carved in different directions. Some of these newer sections contained remains that could not possibly date to the flu pandemic. The forensic team identified clothing and personal effects from multiple time periods, suggesting that bodies had been added to the chambers as recently as the 1990s. The investigation stalled when team members began reporting unusual experiences while working in the tunnels. Equipment malfunctioned without explanation, temperature readings fluctuated wildly, and several investigators claimed to hear voices speaking in languages they could not identify. The team leader, a veteran forensic anthropologist, requested additional personnel and specialized equipment to continue the work. Before the reinforcements could arrive, the situation escalated dramatically. Residents throughout Talkeetna began reporting disturbances that coincided with the investigation timeline. People heard voices calling their names from empty rooms, found their doors standing open in the morning despite being locked at night, and discovered personal items had been moved or rearranged while they slept. The incidents peaked on a Tuesday night when the power grid serving central Talkeetna failed simultaneously across multiple circuits. In the darkness that followed, witnesses reported seeing figures moving through the streets, pale forms that seemed to drift between buildings without making sound. The disturbances continued until dawn, when the power mysteriously restored itself without any technical explanation. I left Talkeetna the next morning. The official investigation was suspended pending review by state authorities, and the access points were resealed with concrete barriers. The geological survey was never completed, and the foundation problems were attributed to normal permafrost degradation caused by climate change. The truth is more complex and far more disturbing. The bodies beneath Talkeetna were not simply preserved by the cold. They were held in some kind of suspended state that allowed them to remain aware of their surroundings. The recent thaw had awakened them, and they were attempting to reclaim a place among the living. I never filed my final report on the Talkeetna survey. Some discoveries are too dangerous to document officially. The town still exists, and tourists still visit to see the quaint buildings and historical displays. They have no idea that beneath their feet lies a network of chambers filled with the restless dead of over a century. If you visit Talkeetna and notice the ground feels unstable beneath your feet, trust that instinct. Some foundations should never be disturbed, and some secrets are better left buried in the permafrost where they belong. I am David Kim, and for 6 years, I served as the building maintenance supervisor for this 14-story concrete monolith that was once a Cold War military barracks. When you are responsible for keeping 300 people alive in a structure that sits in one of the wettest, windiest places in North America, you learn to pay attention to details that others might miss. That attention to detail is what saved my life when residents started disappearing. Whittier exists because of geography and military planning. The town sits at the head of Passage Canal, connected to the outside world by a single tunnel through the mountains that alternates between rail and vehicle traffic. Most of the year, weather conditions make the town nearly inaccessible except by boat or helicopter. The Begich Towers was built to house soldiers during the height of the Cold War, designed to be self-sufficient and defensible against both human enemies and the brutal coastal climate. After the military left, the building was converted to civilian housing. Apartments, a general store, a post office, and a school all exist within the same structure. It is like a vertical small town where everyone knows everyone, and privacy is a luxury that few can afford. As the maintenance supervisor, I had access to every level, every room, and every mechanical space in the building. I knew the residents by name, their schedules, their habits, and their problems. The disappearances started in late October, when the days were getting short, and the storms were building strength in the Gulf of Alaska. Margaret Hendricks, a retired teacher who lived on the 7th floor, failed to pick up her mail for 3 consecutive days. In a building where mail delivery was a social event, this was unusual enough that other residents noticed. I checked on Margaret's apartment using my master key and found it empty but undisturbed. Her belongings were in place, her bed was made, and there were no signs of packing or struggle. The apartment looked like she had stepped out for a few minutes and planned to return shortly. I reviewed the security footage from the lobby and main corridors and found something that made no sense. The cameras showed Margaret leaving the building through the main entrance at 11:15 on Monday night. She was fully dressed and carrying a small bag, walking normally, and showing no signs of distress. The exterior cameras should have captured her exit from the building, but they showed only empty sidewalks at that time. Margaret appeared to leave the building, but never appeared outside. I reported the discrepancy to the Whittier police, which consisted of one part-time officer who lived in the building and handled minor disputes between residents. Officer Janet Walsh reviewed the footage and agreed that something was wrong, but she had no explanation for how someone could exit the building without appearing on the exterior cameras. Margaret's disappearance was officially classified as a missing person case, but the investigation stalled quickly. The Alaska State Troopers had limited resources for cases involving adults who might have left voluntarily, especially in remote locations like Whittier. Margaret had no family in Alaska and few close friends outside the building. After 2 weeks, the active investigation was suspended. 3 weeks later, Robert Chen, from the 9th floor, disappeared under identical circumstances. The security footage showed him leaving through the main entrance at night, but the exterior cameras captured no trace of his departure. His apartment was undisturbed, his car remained in the parking garage, and none of the other residents reported seeing him after the timestamp on the interior cameras. I began conducting my own investigation, starting with a detailed review of the building's surveillance system. The Begich Towers had cameras covering all public areas, stairwells, and building entrances. The system was aging but functional. with recordings stored on hard drives that were replaced monthly. I collected footage from the past 6 months and began looking for patterns. What I found was deeply disturbing. Over the previous year, 12 residents had left the building at night and never appeared on the exterior cameras. The disappearances had been gradual enough that no one had noticed the pattern. People moved away from Whittier regularly, and the assumption had been that these residents had simply relocated without notifying their neighbors. I created a timeline of the disappearances and discovered they occurred in clusters. 3 to 4 people would vanish over a period of weeks. Then there would be months of normal activity before the next cluster began. The pattern suggested someone was systematically selecting residents according to criteria I could not determine. I decided to trace the path that the missing residents had taken when they left the building. The interior cameras showed them walking normally toward the main entrance, but I wanted to verify that they had actually reached the exit. I spent several nights reviewing footage, frame by frame, following each person's movements through the corridors and stairwells. The breakthrough came when I noticed something in the background of one recording. As Margaret Hendricks walked toward the main entrance, a section of wall in the 7th floor corridor appeared to move slightly. The change was subtle, barely visible unless you knew where to look, but it suggested that part of the wall was not solid. I examined that section of corridor during my next shift and found what appeared to be a concealed door. The wall panel was expertly crafted to match the surrounding concrete, but close inspection revealed hairline seams that outlined a rectangular opening. The mechanism that operated the Dector was hidden behind a utility panel that required maintenance keys to access. Behind the concealed door was a narrow stairwell that did not appear on any building plans. The stairs descended below the official basement level into areas that should not have existed. I gathered my equipment and decided to explore the hidden sections of the building that I had been maintaining for 6 years without knowing they were there. The hidden stairwell led to a network of corridors and rooms carved from the bedrock beneath the baggage towers. The construction was military-grade, reinforced concrete and steel that had been built to survive nuclear attack. Emergency lighting illuminated the passages, powered by systems that drew from the building's main electrical grid without appearing on any utility diagrams. The corridors extended in multiple directions, connecting to chambers that served various purposes. I found storage areas filled with military surplus equipment, communication rooms with radio gear that was still functional, and living quarters that appeared to have been recently occupied. The hidden facility was essentially a self-contained bunker that could house dozens of people for extended periods. In one of the larger chambers, I discovered evidence of the missing residents. Personal belongings, clothing, and identification documents were sorted and stored in lockers along the walls. Margaret Hendricks's purse was there, along with Robert Chen's wallet and items belonging to other people I recognized from the building. The collection represented years of accumulated possessions from residents who had supposedly moved away. More disturbing was what I found in the adjacent chamber: medical equipment, including an examination table, surgical instruments, and storage units that appeared to be designed for biological samples. The room was clean and well-maintained, suggesting it was in active use. I collected samples of materials I found there and documented everything with photographs. I continued exploring and found the facility extended much further than I had imagined. Some sections appeared to date from the original military construction in the 1950s, while others showed signs of recent modification and expansion. The hidden complex was larger than the official building above it, a maze of passages and chambers that could easily house the entire population of Whittier. In the deepest section of the facility, I found the residents. They were alive, but in a state I struggled to describe accurately. The missing people were housed in individual cells that were clean and comfortable, but clearly designed for long-term confinement. They appeared to be sedated or under some form of chemical control that left them docile and compliant. Margaret Hendricks was there, along with Robert Chen and the other missing residents. They recognized me but seemed unable to focus or communicate effectively. Their responses were slow and confused, as if they were experiencing the world through a heavy fog. They had been fed and cared for, but their minds had been altered in ways that left them dependent on their captors. I tried to help them leave, but they resisted my efforts and became agitated when I insisted. Whatever had been done to them had created a psychological dependency that made escape seem threatening rather than liberating. They wanted to return to their cells, where they felt safe and provided for. I realized I was dealing with something far more sophisticated than simple kidnapping. The hidden facility was designed for long-term human experimentation or conditioning, operated by people who had intimate knowledge of the building's systems and the residents' routines. The operation had been running for years, selecting isolated individuals who would not be missed and studying them under controlled conditions. I gathered evidence and prepared to contact federal authorities, but before I could act, I was discovered. I returned to my apartment after one of my exploration sessions to find two men waiting in my living room. They were professionally dressed and spoke with the calm authority of people who were accustomed to handling sensitive situations. They identified themselves as representatives of a research organization that operated under federal contracts. They explained that the facility beneath the baggage towers was conducting important work related to psychological conditioning and behavioral modification. The missing residents were volunteers who had consented to participate in long-term studies that would advance scientific understanding of human consciousness. I pointed out that the residents had clearly not volunteered and demanded to know who had authorized the research. The men explained that the authorization came from levels of government that did not answer to local or state authorities. The work was classified and essential to national security interests that I was not cleared to understand. They offered me a choice. I could continue my maintenance duties and receive substantial additional compensation for my discretion, or I could be relocated to a position where my knowledge would not pose a security risk. The relocation, they made clear, would not be voluntary and might involve extended isolation while my case was reviewed by appropriate authorities. I chose a third option. That night, I packed essential belongings and left Whittier using the railroad tunnel during a maintenance window when vehicle traffic was suspended. I made my way to Anchorage and contacted a journalist who specialized in investigating government abuse. I provided him with all the evidence I had collected and detailed maps of the hidden facility. The story was never published. The journalist told me that federal authorities had classified the information under national security provisions and threatened prosecution if he proceeded with publication. My evidence was confiscated, and I was warned that discussing the matter further would result in charges under the Espionage Act. I relocated to the lower 48 and found work in building maintenance in a small town where federal agencies are unlikely to have extensive operations. I monitor news from Whittier occasionally and note that the population of the baggage towers has remained stable. Residents still disappear periodically, but the pattern has become more subtle and the intervals between incidents have lengthened. The lesson I learned in Whittier is that isolation can be used to hide activities that would be impossible in more populated areas. When an entire community lives under one roof and depends on limited infrastructure, controlling information and access becomes relatively simple. The residents of the baggage towers trust their building to keep them safe from the harsh environment outside, but they have no protection from the dangers that exist within their own walls. I am Tyler Kowalski, and for 15 years, I guided trophy hunters through the Chugach Mountains, helping wealthy clients track black bear, moose, and the occasional brown bear that wandered down from the higher elevations. I knew every game trail, every water source, and every place where animals gathered to feed or rest. That knowledge kept my clients safe until someone started hunting the hunters. The town of Hope was founded during the 1896 gold rush and managed to survive long after the easy gold was gone. Most residents these days work in Anchorage and commute the hour drive for the privilege of living somewhere that feels remote without being completely cut off. The hunting guides, myself included, were among the few locals who made their living entirely from the land around Hope. My operation was small and selective. I took no more than 6 hunting parties per season, charging premium rates for personalized service and access to areas that larger outfitters could not reach. My clients were executives, professionals, and retired military who wanted challenging hunts in pristine wilderness. They paid well and expected results, but they also understood that hunting in Alaska required respect for the environment and the animals we pursued. The first incident happened in early September during bow season. I had taken 2 clients, both experienced bow hunters from Texas, into the backcountry east of Hope, where we had been tracking a large black bear for 3 days. The bear was following a predictable pattern, feeding on salmon in Resurrection Creek during the early morning hours before retreating to dense cover for the day. We set up in a tree stand overlooking the creek, positioned to intercept the bear on its way to the feeding area. The clients were competent hunters who understood the importance of patience and silence. We had been in position for 2 hours when the bear appeared, moving slowly along the game trail we had been watching. The shot opportunity was perfect. The lead client drew his bow and released a clean arrow that struck the bear behind the shoulder. The bear ran 30 yards before collapsing, a quick and ethical kill that both clients were proud of. We waited the standard 30 minutes before climbing down to examine the animal. That is when we found the first marker. Driven into a tree near where the bear had fallen was a carved wooden stake about 18 inches long. The wood appeared to be local birch, shaped with traditional tools rather than modern equipment. Symbols had been burned into the surface, geometric patterns that looked like traditional native artwork, but arranged in combinations I had never seen before. I photographed the marker and showed it to Sarah Tanana, a member of the local tribal council who worked as a cultural liaison for the Forest Service. Sarah examined the photos and confirmed that the symbols were based on traditional designs, but she said they were being used incorrectly. The arrangements were wrong, like someone had copied individual elements without understanding their meaning or proper application. Sarah warned me that the marker might represent some kind of territorial claim or spiritual boundary that I should respect. She suggested avoiding that area until she could consult with tribal elders about the significance of the symbols. I agreed to modify my hunting routes, but privately, I doubted that the marker had been placed by anyone with legitimate cultural authority. 2 weeks later, I took another client into a different area south of Hope. The hunter was an investment banker from New York who had limited experience but enthusiastic willingness to learn. We were pursuing moose in the wetlands near Turnagain Pass, where the animals came to feed on aquatic plants during the late afternoon. We found fresh sign and tracked a large bull through thick willows until we located him feeding in a small pond. The stalk required careful movement through difficult terrain, but we managed to get within range for a clean shot. The client made an excellent shot with his rifle, dropping the moose immediately. As we approached the animal, I noticed something wrong with the scene. The moose had been shot through the heart, but there was a second wound in the neck that had not come from my client's rifle. The cut was precise and deep, made with a sharp blade rather than a projectile. The wound was fresh, inflicted within minutes of the rifle shot. I examined the surrounding area and found tracks that did not belong to my client or myself. The prints were made by someone wearing soft-soled boots or moccasins, moving in a pattern that suggested they had been following us throughout the stalk. The tracker had approached the downed moose from the opposite direction, inflicted the knife wound, and disappeared back into the willows. Near the pond, we found another wooden marker, similar to the first, but with different symbol arrangements. This marker had been placed deliberately where we would find it while processing the moose. The message was clear: Someone was watching my hunting activities and wanted me to know they were there. I reported both incidents to the Alaska State Troopers, but the response was limited. The markers were not illegal, and no laws had been broken by someone observing hunting activities on public land. The trooper who took my report suggested that I might be dealing with an activist opposed to hunting, or possibly someone with mental health issues who was fixated on my operation. The third incident changed everything. I was guiding a retired Marine colonel who had requested a challenging brown bear hunt in the remote areas above Hope. Brown bears in that region were not abundant, but I knew of several individuals that lived in the high country and occasionally descended to lower elevations during salmon runs. We hiked 12 miles into the backcountry and established a base camp in a valley that provided access to multiple hunting areas. The colonel was an experienced outdoorsman who understood the dangers of brown bear hunting and followed safety protocols without complaint. We spent 2 days scouting before locating a mature boar feeding on blueberries in an alpine meadow. The approach required a careful stalk across open ground where the bear could easily spot movement. We waited for favorable wind conditions and made our move during the late afternoon when the light was beginning to fade. The colonel made a perfect shot at 200 yards, dropping the bear immediately with a heart shot from his rifle. We approached the bear cautiously, following standard procedures for dealing with potentially dangerous game. The bear was clearly dead, but as we began the field dressing process, I noticed we were not alone. Someone was watching from the tree line, partially concealed behind a large spruce, but visible if you knew where to look. I alerted the colonel, and we both observed the figure for several minutes. The watcher was tall and thin, wearing traditional native clothing, including what appeared to be a fur parka and hide pants. He carried a long spear or lance and remained motionless for extended periods, like someone accustomed to patient observation. When I called out to him, the figure melted back into the forest without responding. We completed our work quickly and returned to base camp, but throughout the night I was aware of movement in the surrounding forest. Someone was circling our camp, maintaining a constant distance, but never approaching close enough for direct confrontation. The next morning, we found our fourth marker. This one was different from the others, larger and more elaborate, with symbols that had been carved deep into the wood and filled with what appeared to be charcoal or burnt material. The marker had been placed directly in front of our tent, impossible to miss when we emerged at dawn. More disturbing was what we found around the marker. Animal bones had been arranged in patterns around the wooden stake, cleaned skulls and long bones from various species, positioned according to some system I could not understand. The arrangement was clearly ceremonial, but the ceremony was not from any tradition I recognized. I photographed everything and packed our equipment quickly. The colonel was a pragmatic man who understood when tactical withdrawal was the appropriate response to an unclear threat. We hiked out that day, covering the 12 miles to the trailhead without stopping for extended breaks. Back in Hope, I consulted with Sarah Tanana again and showed her the photographs from our base camp. Her reaction was immediate and alarmed. She said the bone arrangements were not from any traditional ceremony. She knew, but they incorporated elements that suggested someone with partial knowledge of native spiritual practices was attempting to create their own rituals. Sarah contacted tribal law enforcement and arranged for a joint investigation with the Alaska State Troopers. A team of officers hiked into the area where we had encountered the Watcher, and what they found confirmed my worst suspicions about what I was dealing with. The investigation team discovered a camp hidden in dense forest about a mile from where we had encountered the figure. The camp was sophisticated and well supplied, clearly intended for long-term occupation. The occupant had constructed shelters using traditional methods combined with modern materials, creating a base that would be difficult to detect from ground or air surveillance. More disturbing was the evidence of what the camp's occupant had been doing. The officers found collections of personal items taken from hunters, including wallets, hunting licenses, and equipment that had been reported missing over the past 2 years. They also found detailed journals documenting hunting activities throughout the region, with particular focus on my clients and hunting locations. The journals revealed an individual who had become obsessed with what he viewed as the desecration of sacred hunting grounds by outsiders. The writing showed progressive deterioration of rational thought, with increasing focus on the need to protect the animals from unworthy hunters who did not understand the spiritual aspects of taking life. Most concerning were the detailed plans for escalating his intervention in hunting activities. The early markers had been warnings intended to discourage hunters from specific areas. The more elaborate ceremonies were preparations for direct action against hunters who ignored the warnings. The final entries described plans for using traditional hunting methods to eliminate modern hunters who refused to respect his territorial claims. The camp was empty when the officers arrived, but they found evidence that the occupant had left recently and might be planning to return. They established surveillance and waited, but after a week with no contact, the operation was suspended due to resource limitations. I never guided another hunt in the Hope area. The risk had become too great, not just from the individual who had been stalking my clients, but from the uncertainty about whether he was working alone or as part of a larger group with similar beliefs. I relocated my operation to other areas of Alaska where the hunting pressure was lighter, and the local population was more supportive of regulated hunting activities. The identity of the watcher was never confirmed, but the investigation suggested he was likely a local resident with mixed native and European ancestry who had developed his own interpretation of traditional hunting practices. The combination of legitimate cultural knowledge and personal psychological issues had created someone capable of surviving indefinitely in the wilderness while pursuing what he believed was a sacred mission to protect the land from unworthy intruders. Hope still attracts hunters, but guides working in the area are more cautious about client selection and route planning. The markers still appear occasionally, and hikers sometimes report encounters with a figure watching from the forest. The message remains the same. Some places demand respect that goes beyond following regulations and obtaining proper permits. I am Lisa Rodriguez, and for 4 years, I operated the automated lighthouse on Frederick Point, maintaining the beacon that guided vessels through the treacherous waters of Frederick Sound. The lighthouse had been automated since the 1980s, but the Coast Guard still required a human operator to monitor equipment and weather conditions during the busy summer fishing season. The job suited my temperament and my need for solitude after a difficult divorce that had left me seeking isolation from the complications of modern life. The lighthouse station included a small residence, workshop space, and communication equipment that kept me connected to the Coast Guard station in Juneau. My responsibilities were straightforward: maintain the beacon, monitor marine radio traffic, and report unusual conditions that might affect vessel safety. Petersburg has always been shrouded in fog. The combination of warm ocean currents and cold air masses creates persistent low clouds that can reduce visibility to zero within minutes. Local fishermen understand the patterns and plan their activities accordingly, but visiting vessels often underestimate how quickly conditions can deteriorate in southeast Alaska waters. The fog I'm telling you about was different. It appeared in late June during a period of unusually stable weather when clear skies were predicted for the entire region. Instead of the typical gray marine layer that hugged the water surface, this fog formed distinct banks that moved against the prevailing wind patterns and maintained sharp boundaries that defied meteorological explanation. The first indication that something was wrong came during my routine evening radio check with the Coast Guard. I reported clear skies and unlimited visibility at 1800 hours, but 30 minutes later, a wall of fog approached from the northwest, moving at approximately 15 knots directly toward Frederick Point. The fog bank was perfectly rectangular, roughly 2 miles wide, and extending from the water surface to about 300 feet altitude. I watched through binoculars as the fog engulfed a commercial fishing vessel that had been working crab pots about a mile offshore. The boat disappeared completely into the gray wall, and I attempted to raise them on marine radio to offer navigation assistance. The vessel responded immediately, reporting normal operations and no visibility problems. According to their radio transmission, they were operating in clear weather with light winds and calm seas. I contacted Coast Guard Juneau to report the discrepancy between my observations and the vessel's radio reports. The duty officer confirmed that weather conditions throughout the region were clear and stable, with no fog reported by any other stations. He suggested that I might be experiencing localized conditions caused by temperature differentials around the lighthouse point. Over the following hour, I watched 3 more vessels enter the fog bank. In each case, the boats disappeared from visual contact but continued normal radio communications as if operating in clear weather. The fog remained stationary despite wind conditions that should have dispersed it quickly, maintaining its rectangular shape and defined boundaries. At 2100 hours, the fishing vessel that had first entered the fog emerged from the opposite side of the bank. I observed the boat through binoculars as it cleared the fog boundary, and immediately noticed something that made me question what I was seeing. The vessel appeared identical to the one that had entered, but the crew members visible on deck were different people wearing different clothing. I raised the vessel on radio and asked them to identify themselves. The response came from the same call sign and vessel name, but the voice was different from the captain I had spoken with earlier. When I asked about their fishing operations, the new captain reported they had just arrived in the area and were beginning to set gear for the first time. I documented the incident in my logbook and reported it to Coast Guard Juneau, but the duty officer had changed shifts, and the new operator showed little interest in my observations. I was advised to monitor the situation and report any actual emergencies or navigation hazards. The fog bank remained in position through the night, maintaining its unnatural shape and boundaries despite changing wind conditions. I conducted hourly visual inspections and noted that the internal structure of the fog appeared to shift and swirl in patterns that suggested organized movement rather than random atmospheric dynamics. The next morning brought more vessels into the area, including the Alaska State Ferry that connected Petersburg to other southeast communities. I watched in growing alarm as the ferry entered the fog bank on its normal schedule, carrying approximately 60 passengers and crew members. The ferry maintained radio contact throughout its passage through the fog, reporting normal navigation conditions and estimated arrival times. But when the vessel emerged 20 minutes later, I could see through binoculars that fundamental changes had occurred. The ferry's paint scheme was different, displaying colors and markings that I had never seen on Alaska Marine Highway vessels. I contacted the ferry directly and asked them to confirm their vessel identification and passenger manifest. The response indicated they were operating under a different name and route number than the ferry that had entered the fog. When I asked about passengers, the captain reported carrying 43 people, 17 fewer than the manifest I had monitored during their departure from Wrangell. I immediately contacted Coast Guard Juneau and requested emergency assistance to investigate what appeared to be vessel substitution or possible hijacking. The duty officer took my report seriously and dispatched a patrol boat to intercept the ferry for inspection. The patrol boat reached the ferry 4 hours later and conducted a thorough examination of the vessel and its occupants. According to their report, everything was normal. The ferry was properly documented, the crew carried valid credentials, and the passengers had legitimate tickets and identification. The Coast Guard found no evidence of irregularities or criminal activity. But the patrol boat's report contradicted my direct observations. They described a standard Alaska Marine Highway ferry with normal paint markings, while I had clearly observed a vessel with different colors and configuration. The passenger count in their report matched my original manifest. not the reduced number reported by the ferry captain after emerging from the fog. I began systematic documentation of all vessel movements through the fog bank, recording times, vessel descriptions, radio communications, and crew observations. Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear and deeply disturbing. Vessels that entered the fog bank emerged with different crews, altered configurations, and modified operational parameters, but official inspections consistently found nothing unusual. The fog bank expanded gradually, growing from 2 miles wide to nearly 5 miles across while maintaining its rectangular shape and stationary position. More vessels were affected, including fishing boats, pleasure craft, and commercial traffic bound for Petersburg and other southeast ports. I attempted to alert local authorities and marine safety organizations, but my reports were dismissed as observer error or equipment malfunction. The official position was that fog banks could create optical illusions that made vessels appear different than they actually were, and that radio communications could be distorted by atmospheric conditions. The breakthrough in my investigation came when I decided to enter the fog bank myself. I launched a small skiff from the lighthouse dock and motored toward the gray wall, maintaining radio contact with Coast Guard Juneau throughout my approach. I documented everything with a waterproof camera and GPS unit. As I entered the fog, visibility dropped to less than 10 feet, but the GPS continued to function normally. I proceeded slowly through the bank, following a straight course that should have brought me out the other side within 15 minutes. Instead, I found myself in an area of open water, surrounded by fog that extended beyond the horizon in all directions. The water in this area was different from Frederick Sound. The temperature was warmer, the color was a deeper blue, and the marine life included species that do not exist in southeast Alaska waters. I observed tropical fish, coral formations, and seabirds that belonged in equatorial regions rather than the North Pacific. More disturbing were the other vessels I encountered in this anomalous environment. I found fishing boats, ferries, and pleasure craft that had entered the fog bank over the past several weeks, but their crews reported they had been operating in these waters for months or years. They had no memory of entering fog or transitioning from Alaska waters to this tropical environment. I attempted to guide several vessels back toward what I believed was the fog boundary, but they resisted my efforts and insisted they were in their normal operating areas. The crews appeared healthy and content, but they showed no interest in returning to their original destinations or schedules. I spent 6 hours in the anomalous waters before finding an exit point that returned me to Frederick Sound. When I emerged from the fog bank, I discovered that 12 hours had passed, according to my radio logs, despite my instruments showing only 6 hours of elapsed time. My report to Coast Guard Juneau resulted in a formal investigation that included oceanographic specialists, meteorological experts, and representatives from several federal agencies. The investigation team conducted extensive testing around the fog bank, but found nothing unusual in the atmospheric or oceanic conditions. The official conclusion was that I had experienced a complex navigational error combined with equipment malfunction that created the illusion of anomalous conditions. My observations were attributed to stress, fatigue, and the psychological effects of extended isolation at a remote duty station. I was relieved of my lighthouse duties and transferred to administrative work in Juneau, pending psychological evaluation. The lighthouse station was automated completely, with maintenance performed by periodic visits from Coast Guard technicians rather than a resident operator. I never returned to Frederick Point, but I continued monitoring marine radio traffic from the Petersburg area. The fog bank persisted for several more months before gradually dissipating in early September. During that period, dozens of vessels passed through the area, and official records show no irregularities or incidents. But I maintained contact with families and friends of people who had been aboard vessels that entered the fog bank. Their reports painted a different picture. Crew members returned with subtle personality changes, altered memories, and skills or knowledge they had not possessed before their voyage. Some passengers reported dreams or memories of tropical locations that felt more real than their actual experiences in Alaska. The most disturbing reports came from wives and family members who insisted that their loved ones had returned as different people. The changes were subtle but persistent. Alterations in behavior, preferences, and emotional responses that suggested fundamental shifts in personality or identity. I relocated to the lower 48 and found work with a private marine safety organization that was not connected to federal agencies. I never filed a formal report about my experiences at Frederick Point, but I shared my observations with researchers who investigate anomalous phenomena in marine environments. The Petersburg fog taught me that the boundaries between different realities are thinner than we assume, especially in remote areas where natural forces operate beyond our understanding. The Inside Passage has always been a place where navigation requires respect for conditions that can change without warning. But some changes involve more than weather and tides. If you travel the waters around Petersburg and encounter fog that moves against the wind or maintains unnatural boundaries, consider altering your course to avoid passage through areas where the normal rules of navigation may not apply. Some destinations are not worth reaching if the journey changes who you are when you arrive. The fog around Frederick Point still appears occasionally, though it no longer maintains the persistent presence I observed during my time at the lighthouse. Local fishermen report brief encounters with gray banks that seem to exist independently of weather conditions, and some vessels still report minor discrepancies in their passage times or crew observations. Petersburg remains a working fishing community where practical people focus on the challenges of making a living from the sea. They do not discuss the fog that sometimes appears without meteorological explanation, and they do not ask too many questions about crew members who return from fishing trips with slightly different personalities or memories of places they have never been. I am Mark O'Brien, and for 12 years I owned the general store that served as the commercial heart of this isolated community of 277 people on the southern tip of the Kenai Peninsula. Running the store meant I knew everyone's shopping patterns, their seasonal routines, and their personal habits. That knowledge made me the first person to recognize the pattern that defines Seldovia's most closely guarded secret. Seldovia sits across Kachemak Bay from Homer, accessible only by boat or small aircraft for most of the year. The town was founded by Russian traders in the 1800s and has survived as a fishing community through boom and bust cycles that destroyed similar settlements throughout Alaska. The residents are independent, resourceful, and protective of their privacy in ways that only people who have chosen extreme isolation can understand. The store I operated was more than a business. It served as the unofficial community center where residents gathered to collect mail, share news, and maintain the social connections that prevent small towns from dissolving into collections of isolated individuals. During the summer months, I served tourists and fishing guides, but winter was when the store became essential to the survival of the permanent residents. My first winter in Seldovia, I attributed the dramatic drop in business to normal seasonal patterns. Tourist traffic disappeared after Labor Day, commercial fishing slowed significantly, and many residents traveled to Anchorage or other cities for extended visits with family. The store's customer base dropped from over 300 regular shoppers to fewer than 150. What seemed unusual was how abruptly the change occurred. On October 15th, exactly half my regular customers simply stopped coming to the store. Not gradually, as people made decisions to leave town for the winter, but all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch that removed them from the community. I assumed they had left Seldovia for seasonal work or family visits, but when I checked with the air taxi services and boat operators who provided transportation to Homer, none of them reported unusual numbers of departures. The missing residents had not left town through normal transportation channels, but they were clearly no longer participating in community activities. I began paying closer attention to who remained active during the winter months and who had disappeared from normal routines. The pattern was strange, but consistent. The missing residents included people from all age groups and occupations, with no obvious characteristics that would explain why they were affected while others were not. Sarah Patterson, who ran the post office, continued her normal duties throughout the winter, but seemed confused when I asked about mail delivery to the missing residents. She insisted that everyone was receiving their mail normally and showed no awareness that half the town had become inactive. When I pressed for details about specific individuals, Sarah became evasive and changed the subject. The same response occurred when I spoke with other year-round residents who remained active. They acknowledged that winter was quieter than summer, but they showed no awareness that specific community members had become absent from normal activities. When I mentioned names of people who had not been seen for weeks, the active residents responded as if those individuals were still present and participating normally. I decided to conduct my own investigation, starting with visits to the homes of residents who had stopped coming to the store. The first address I checked was Janet Morrison's house near the boat harbor. Janet had been one of my most regular customers, stopping by almost daily for coffee and conversation. She had not been in the store for 6 weeks. I found Janet at home, but she was different in ways that were difficult to define precisely. She answered the door normally and invited me inside, but her responses to conversation were slow and disconnected. She seemed to be present physically but absent mentally, like someone recovering from anesthesia or experiencing the effects of strong medication. Janet's house was maintained normally, with food in the refrigerator, clean clothes in the closets, and no signs of neglect or abandonment. But the house felt empty despite her presence, as if the personality that had made it a home had been temporarily removed while the basic functions of residence continued automatically. I visited a dozen more homes over the following weeks and found the same pattern in each case. The missing residents were physically present but mentally absent, functioning at a basic level that maintained their households but eliminated their participation in community activities. They prepared meals, performed routine maintenance, and maintained personal hygiene, but they showed no interest in social interaction or activities beyond immediate survival needs. Most disturbing was their complete lack of awareness that anything had changed. When I asked about their absence from the store or community events, they responded with confusion and insisted they had been maintaining their normal routines. They had no memory of the conversations we had held in previous weeks, no recognition of the passage of time, and no curiosity about why I was visiting their homes. I documented everything in a journal, recording dates, names, and detailed observations about the behavior and responses of the affected residents. The pattern was consistent across all cases. On October 15th, exactly half the population of Seldovia had entered a state of reduced consciousness that eliminated their participation in community life while maintaining their basic biological functions. I consulted medical references and found descriptions of conditions that produced similar symptoms, but nothing that could affect multiple people simultaneously without an obvious cause like contaminated water supply or environmental toxin. I collected samples of municipal water, tested food supplies at the store, and monitored air quality, but found no evidence of substances that could produce the observed effects. The breakthrough came when I realized that the affected residents were not completely inactive. They left their homes regularly, always at night, and traveled to locations that I had not been able to identify. I began conducting surveillance, following affected individuals when they left their houses after dark. The night journeys followed predictable patterns. The affected residents would leave their homes between midnight and 2 in the morning, walking in small groups toward the forest, that surrounded Seldovia on 3 sides. They moved with purpose, but without apparent awareness of their surroundings, like sleepwalkers following predetermined routes. I followed one group to a clearing in the forest about 2 miles from town. The clearing contained a structure that I had never seen before despite 12 years of hiking the local trails. The building appeared to be constructed from local materials, but using architectural techniques that did not match any regional traditions I recognized. The affected residents entered the structure and remained inside for several hours before returning to town along the same routes they had used to reach the clearing. I observed this pattern for several nights before deciding to investigate the structure during daylight hours when the affected residents were at home in their reduced consciousness state. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with multiple rooms connected by passages that seemed to extend underground. The construction was sophisticated, using fitted stone and timber joinery that would have required skilled craftsmen and considerable time to complete. The structure showed signs of regular use, but no indication of who had built it or when. Inside the building, I found evidence of activities that I struggled to interpret. The rooms contained furniture and equipment that appeared to be designed for large group gatherings, but the purpose of those gatherings was not obvious. Some rooms contained what appeared to be sleeping accommodations for dozens of people, while others held equipment that resembled medical or scientific instruments. Most disturbing were the detailed records I found in one of the underground chambers. Handwritten logs documented the activities of Seldovia residents over multiple years, with particular focus on their behavior during the winter months. The records included personal information, family histories, and psychological profiles that could only have been compiled through extensive observation and interaction. The logs revealed that the winter pattern I had observed was not recent. For over 20 years, half of Seldovia's population had been entering the reduced consciousness state during the same 73-day period each winter. The affected individuals rotated on a schedule that ensured everyone in the community eventually participated in the pattern. I found my own name in the records, along with detailed observations about my behavior, business operations, and personal habits. According to the logs, I was scheduled to enter the affected state during the following winter season. The records indicated that my awareness of the pattern would be eliminated and my participation would become automatic like the other residents. I realized I was dealing with something far more complex than a medical condition or environmental contamination. The structure in the forest was the center of an operation that had been controlling the population of Seldovia for decades, using methods that I could not understand or counter effectively. I gathered copies of the records and documented the structure with photographs, then prepared to leave Seldovia before I could be drawn into the pattern that controlled the other residents. But when I attempted to contact air taxi services to arrange transportation, I discovered that my communications were being monitored and blocked. Phone calls to Homer resulted in busy signals or disconnected lines. Radio communications produced static or no response. Internet service, which had been unreliable under the best conditions, became completely unavailable. I was effectively isolated from outside contact during the period when I most needed to escape. I decided to attempt leaving Seldovia by boat, using a small skiff that I kept at the harbor for personal use. The boat was old but seaworthy, and I had enough fuel to reach Homer if weather conditions remained favorable. I loaded supplies and prepared to make the crossing at night, when my departure would be less likely to be observed. As I prepared to launch the skiff, I encountered several of the affected residents standing on the dock. They did not attempt to stop me, but they watched with the same disconnected awareness they showed toward all activities. Their presence felt like a warning that my attempt to leave was expected and perhaps futile. I launched the boat and headed across Kachemak Bay toward the lights of Homer. The crossing normally took 90 minutes in good conditions, but after 2 hours of travel, I found myself approaching the Seldovia harbor again, despite maintaining a steady course toward Homer. I had somehow traveled in a circle, despite clear visibility and normal compass readings. I attempted the crossing 3 more times with identical results. Each attempt brought me back to Seldovia, regardless of my navigation efforts or route planning. The bay itself seemed to be directing me back to the town, using methods that defied my understanding of marine navigation. I returned to my house and found a handwritten note that had been left on my kitchen table. The note welcomed me to my final winter as an observer and explained that my transition to participant status would occur on schedule. The note assured me that the process was natural and beneficial, and that my concerns about the community would be resolved through participation rather than resistance. On January 15th, exactly 73 days after the pattern had begun, the affected residents returned to normal consciousness and resumed their community activities. They showed no memory of the winter months and responded to questions about their absence with confusion and denial. I never discovered who or what controlled the pattern that defined winter life in Seldovia. When the next October arrived, I found myself joining the affected group despite my efforts to maintain awareness and resistance. I spent 73 days in the reduced consciousness state, and when I returned to normal awareness in January, I had no memory of what had occurred during those missing months. I sold the store that spring and left Seldovia permanently, but I retained enough memory of my investigation to understand that some communities exist under conditions that outsiders cannot comprehend or resist. Seldovia continues to function as a fishing town where half the population disappears each winter, and the remaining residents show no awareness that anything unusual occurs during the silent season. I am Jennifer Walsh, and for 8 years, I worked as an emergency medical technician covering the northern section of this highway, responding to accidents and medical emergencies in an area where the nearest hospital could be hours away. My job required me to see human trauma in its rawest forms, but nothing in my training prepared me for the pattern of accidents that began appearing along mile marker 23 in late September. Haines sits at the northern end of the Inside Passage, a town of 2,080 people who depend on tourism, fishing, and the ferry service that connects them to the outside world. The highway that bears the town's name is the primary land route for residents and visitors traveling to interior Alaska, but it is also one of the most dangerous roads in the state. Weather conditions change rapidly, wildlife encounters are common, and the remoteness means that help can be hours away when accidents occur. My service area covered the section of highway from Haines to the Canadian border, 68 miles of mountain roads that included steep grades, sharp curves, and limited visibility areas where accidents were unfortunately routine. I responded to slide-offs, animal strikes, mechanical failures, and weather-related incidents on a regular basis. But the calls I started receiving in September were different from anything I had encountered in my career. The first unusual incident occurred on a Thursday morning when I was dispatched to a single vehicle accident at mile marker 23. The report indicated a pickup truck had left the roadway and struck a tree, with one occupant requiring medical assistance. The location was in a section of highway that curved through dense forest, an area where drivers often encountered moose or black bears crossing the road. I arrived at the scene within 20 minutes of the initial call and found a late model pickup truck wrapped around a large spruce tree about 30 feet from the highway. The impact had been severe enough to deploy the airbags and cause significant front-end damage, but the vehicle had struck the tree in a way that suggested the driver had steered deliberately off the roadway, rather than losing control accidentally. The driver was conscious but disoriented, complaining of severe abdominal pain, despite the fact that his seatbelt and airbag had protected him from the type of chest and abdominal injuries typically associated with frontal impacts. When I began my assessment, I discovered something that made no medical sense given the nature of the accident. The driver had sustained a surgical incision in his lower abdomen, approximately 6 inches long and closed with sutures that appeared to have been placed by someone with medical training. The incision was fresh, probably made within the past few hours, but it showed no signs of bleeding or infection. The suture work was precise and professional, far beyond what could be accomplished under emergency field conditions. I questioned the driver about the incision, but he had no memory of receiving medical treatment or surgical intervention. He insisted that he had been driving normally when he suddenly felt severe pain and lost consciousness, waking up after the accident with no recollection of steering off the road or colliding with the tree. I transported the driver to the hospital in Haines, where emergency room physicians confirmed that he had received professional surgical treatment. X-rays and CT scans revealed that his right kidney had been surgically removed with techniques that indicated the work of an experienced surgeon. The patient had no prior medical history that would justify kidney removal, and he maintained that he had never consented to or received surgical treatment. The case was reported to Alaska State Troopers as a possible assault, but the investigation stalled quickly. The patient could provide no information about where or when the surgery had occurred, and there were no witnesses to his activities prior to the accident. The trooper who handled the case suggested that the driver might have received emergency medical treatment somewhere and lost memory of the incident due to trauma or medication. 3 weeks later, I responded to a similar call at mile marker 22, less than a mile from the first incident. A sedan had left the roadway and rolled into a creek, with the female driver trapped inside the vehicle. The accident appeared to be another case of a driver losing control and leaving the highway. But when I extracted the victim, I found the same type of surgical incision I had observed in the previous case. The driver had undergone removal of her left kidney through a surgical procedure that had been performed with the same professional technique and precision as the first case. She had no memory of receiving medical treatment and insisted that she had been feeling perfectly normal when she suddenly experienced severe pain and lost control of her vehicle. I began documenting these cases more carefully, photographing the surgical incisions and collecting detailed information about the victims' activities prior to their accidents. Both drivers had been traveling alone on the highway during daylight hours, and both reported normal driving conditions with no mechanical problems or weather issues that could explain their loss of control. The pattern continued over the following months. I responded to 6 more single-vehicle accidents at locations between mile marker 20 and mile marker 25, all involving drivers who had undergone surgical removal of kidneys, livers, or other organs that could be transplanted. The surgery in each case was performed with professional skill, and the victims had no memory of when or where the procedures had taken place. I contacted the Alaska State Troopers and requested a formal investigation of what appeared to be a series of related incidents. The trooper assigned to the case was initially skeptical, suggesting that the victims might be involved in illegal organ sales or medical tourism that they were concealing for personal reasons. But when I provided detailed documentation of the accident patterns and surgical evidence, the investigation was escalated to involve federal authorities. The FBI has jurisdiction over crimes that cross state boundaries, and the possibility that someone was operating an illegal organ harvesting operation in a remote area required resources that local law enforcement could not provide. The federal investigation revealed disturbing information about the market for transplant organs and the methods used by criminal organizations to obtain them. Black market organ sales generate billions of dollars annually, and the demand for healthy organs far exceeds the supply available through legal donation programs. Remote highways like the Haines Highway provide ideal locations for organ harvesting operations because victims can be intercepted, treated, and returned to their vehicles without witnesses or immediate law enforcement response. The isolation and limited medical facilities also make it difficult for victims to obtain immediate treatment that might preserve evidence of the crimes. The investigation team established surveillance along the affected section of highway and began monitoring traffic patterns to identify potential perpetrators. They also analyzed the surgical evidence from the victims and determined that the organ removal procedures were being performed by someone with extensive medical training and access to sophisticated equipment. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered a network of logging roads that connected to the highway in the area where the incidents were occurring. The roads provided access to remote locations where surgical procedures could be performed without detection, and they offered escape routes that avoided main highway checkpoints. Following these logging roads, the investigation team found a sophisticated medical facility hidden in the forest about 5 miles from the highway. The facility included a complete surgical suite, recovery areas, and refrigerated storage units designed to preserve harvested organs during transport to buyers. The facility was operated by a group that included a surgeon who had lost his medical license due to malpractice issues, several medical technicians with military training, and security personnel with criminal backgrounds. They had been operating for over 2 years, targeting lone travelers on remote highways throughout Alaska and Western Canada. Their method was to force selected vehicles off the road using techniques that made the incidents appear to be accidents. Victims were transported to the hidden facility where organs were removed under anesthesia, then returned to their vehicles and staged in accidents that provided cover for their medical condition. The criminal organization had harvested organs from over 30 victims, selling them to buyers throughout North America and Asia. The profits were enormous, with individual organs selling for tens of thousands of dollars to recipients who could not obtain transplants through legal channels. The raid on the facility resulted in the arrest of 8 individuals and the seizure of medical equipment worth over $2 million. Investigators found evidence linking the organization to similar operations in other remote areas, suggesting that highway organ harvesting had become a widespread criminal enterprise. The victims I had treated were provided with follow-up medical care and counseling to help them deal with the trauma of discovering they had been unknowing organ donors. Most of them experienced significant psychological effects from learning that they had been drugged, surgically violated, and used as sources of profit for criminal organizations. The legal proceedings took over a year to complete, with the surgeon receiving a life sentence for multiple counts of assault and conspiracy charges. The other organization members received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years, and the case became a landmark prosecution for crimes involving illegal organ trafficking. I continued working as an EMT in the Haines area, but the cases had changed my perspective on the isolation and vulnerability that characterizes much of Alaska. Remote highways that provide scenic beauty and wildlife viewing opportunities also create conditions where predators can operate with minimal risk of detection or interruption. The psychological impact of those cases never completely faded. Every accident call along that section of highway reminded me that predators are not always wild animals that cross roads unexpectedly. Sometimes they are humans who have chosen to view other people as sources of profit rather than fellow human beings deserving of safety and respect. I implemented new protocols for documenting accident scenes and communicating with law enforcement whenever I encountered suspicious circumstances. The medical evidence that had seemed impossible to explain became a crucial part of identifying and prosecuting criminals who were exploiting the isolation of Alaska's highway system. The organ harvesting operation was dismantled, but the demand for black market transplants continues to drive similar criminal enterprises in remote locations throughout North America. Highway travelers, especially those traveling alone, remain vulnerable to predators who use sophisticated methods to select and victimize people who are unlikely to be missed quickly. The section of highway where the incidents occurred has returned to normal traffic patterns, with no unusual accident reports or medical emergencies. But I still feel uneasy when I respond to calls in that area, knowing that the isolation and remoteness that define much of Alaska also provide cover for crimes that most people cannot imagine. The lesson I learned from those cases is that in remote areas, help may be hours away when you need it most, but predators can be much closer than you realize. Trusting strangers, accepting assistance from unknown individuals, or allowing yourself to be isolated from normal traffic patterns can create opportunities for people who view others as sources of profit rather than fellow travelers deserving of safety and respect. The Haines Highway remains one of Alaska's most scenic and important transportation routes, connecting coastal communities to interior regions through some of the most beautiful wilderness in North America. But beauty and isolation are not always compatible with safety, and travelers who choose remote routes must balance their desire for adventure against the reality that some dangers cannot be anticipated or avoided through normal precautions. The victims of the organ harvesting operation survived their experiences, but they carry permanent reminders of their vulnerability and the reality that predators sometimes operate in places where help is not readily available. Their stories serve as warnings that the most dangerous wildlife encountered on Alaska's highways sometimes walks on two legs and uses medical training to exploit rather than heal the people they encounter. I am Robert Campbell, and for 11 years, I worked as a park ranger responsible for wildlife monitoring and research in the areas surrounding the park boundaries. My job required extensive field work in remote locations where I documented animal populations, tracked migration patterns, and investigated unusual incidents that might affect the ecosystem balance. The work suited my background in wildlife biology and my preference for spending time in places where human impact was minimal. Gustavus exists primarily to support park operations and the tourists who come to see glaciers, whales, and the kind of wildlife that has been eliminated from most of North America. The community is small enough that everyone knows each other, and professional enough that serious scientific work gets done without the bureaucratic interference that plagues larger operations. The area I am going to describe is located approximately 15 miles northeast of Gustavus, in a section of coastal forest that should have been identical to thousands of similar locations throughout southeast Alaska. Dense stands of spruce and hemlock, muskeg meadows, and salmon streams that support healthy populations of bears, wolves, and smaller wildlife. Nothing about the topography or vegetation suggested that this location was different from the surrounding wilderness. The first indication that something was wrong came during routine wildlife surveys in late August. I was conducting population counts for Sitka black-tailed deer, a species that provides an important food source for the region's predators. The survey involved hiking predetermined transects through the forest and recording deer sign, direct observations, and evidence of predation. On the third day of surveys, I entered an area where the wildlife sign abruptly disappeared, not gradually reduced, as would be normal when moving between different habitat types, but completely absent within the span of a few hundred yards. No deer tracks, no scat, no browse damage on vegetation, and no predator sign indicating that carnivores were using the area for hunting or travel. The absence of wildlife was made more unusual by the fact that the habitat appeared to be excellent for deer and other species. The forest canopy provided protection from weather and aerial predators. The understory contained abundant food sources, and small creeks provided reliable water supplies. Every factor that wildlife biologists use to evaluate habitat quality indicated that the area should have supported dense animal populations. I expanded my survey to determine the boundaries of the wildlife absence zone and discovered that it formed a rough circle approximately 2 miles in diameter. Animals approached the edge of this zone during their normal activities, but none appeared to enter the area or establish territories within its boundaries. The transition was sharp and consistent, like an invisible barrier that wildlife recognized and respected. I collected vegetation samples from inside and outside the zone to test for contamination that might explain the wildlife avoidance. Heavy metals, pesticides, or other toxins could create areas that animals instinctively avoided, but the initial field tests showed no obvious chemical differences between the affected area and the surrounding forest. More puzzling were the physical characteristics I observed within the zone. Plant growth appeared normal, with healthy trees and understory vegetation showing no signs of stress or disease. Stream flow was consistent with adjacent watersheds, and water quality testing revealed no unusual conditions. By every measure I could apply, the area was identical to the surrounding forest. The breakthrough came when I decided to establish a temporary research camp within the zone to conduct extended observations. I set up a base camp near the center of the affected area and began systematic documentation of environmental conditions using instruments that recorded temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, and other factors that might explain the wildlife patterns. The first night in camp revealed conditions that challenged my understanding of basic physics. My instruments recorded temperature variations that defied the laws of thermodynamics. Air temperature would drop 20 degrees within seconds, then return to normal just as quickly. Barometric pressure fluctuated in patterns that suggested rapid altitude changes, despite the fact that my camp was located at a constant elevation. More disturbing were the temporal anomalies I began to observe. My watch, which had been keeping accurate time for years, began gaining and losing time in irregular patterns. A process that should have taken 10 minutes, like boiling water for coffee, would sometimes take an hour, and other times would be completed in what felt like seconds. I documented these anomalies with multiple instruments and found that all of them showed similar inconsistencies. GPS units gave readings that placed my location in different coordinates from 1 minute to the next. Compasses pointed in directions that changed without any magnetic interference that I could identify. Altimeters showed elevation readings that varied by hundreds of feet while I remained in the same physical location. On the third day of observations, I encountered the phenomenon that defined the true nature of the zone. While hiking along one of the streams that flowed through the area, I discovered the carcass of a moose that appeared to have died recently. The body showed no signs of predation, disease, or injury, and the preservation was excellent, despite the fact that scavengers should have found it within hours. I approached the carcass to conduct a standard field necropsy and determine the cause of death. As I began my examination, I realized that the moose was not a contemporary animal. The bone structure, dental characteristics, and body proportions were consistent with moose subspecies that had been extinct in Alaska for thousands of years. I collected tissue samples and photographed the carcass, then continued my survey of the stream. Within the next mile, I found the remains of other animals that should not have existed in the current ecosystem. A short-faced bear, extinct for over 10,000 years. American cheetah, which had never existed in Alaska during recorded history. A dire wolf, perfectly preserved, but representing a species that had vanished during the Pleistocene epoch. The carcasses were distributed along the stream in a pattern that suggested they had died at different times, but their preservation was uniformly excellent. No decomposition, no scavenger damage, and no signs of the natural processes that normally reduce animal remains to bones within months of death. I realized I was dealing with something far beyond normal wildlife biology. The zone was somehow collecting animals from different time periods and preserving them in conditions that defied natural processes. The absence of contemporary wildlife was not due to environmental factors, but because the area existed outside the normal flow of time that governs biological systems. I established contact with colleagues at the University of Alaska and described my findings, but the response was skeptical. The preservation of extinct species in pristine condition was too extraordinary to accept without extensive verification, and the temporal anomalies I described contradicted established scientific principles. I invited a team of researchers to visit the site and verify my observations. The team included paleontologists, physicists, and other specialists who could evaluate the evidence and provide independent assessment of the phenomena I had documented. The research team spent a week in the zone and confirmed my findings, but their presence seemed to destabilize whatever forces were responsible for the anomalous conditions. The temporal fluctuations became more severe, with entire hours passing in what felt like minutes, and other periods where seconds stretched into subjective hours. More disturbing were the changes in the preserved specimens. The extinct animals began showing signs of decomposition that progressed at accelerated rates, as if the natural processes that had been suspended were now operating at many times normal speed. Within days, perfectly preserved carcasses that had remained intact for unknown periods were reduced to scattered bones. The research team decided to evacuate the zone when their instruments began malfunctioning in ways that posed safety hazards. GPS units showed locations that placed them hundreds of miles from their actual position. Radio communications became impossible due to interference that seemed to originate from within the zone itself. Most critically, team members began experiencing disorientation and memory problems that suggested their cognitive functions were being affected by the temporal anomalies. I was the last researcher to leave the zone, and as I hiked toward the boundary, I observed changes that suggested the area was returning to normal conditions. The temporal anomalies diminished gradually, barometric pressure stabilized, and my instruments began providing consistent readings. When I crossed the boundary and looked back toward the zone, the forest appeared completely normal. Wildlife sign reappeared immediately, with fresh tracks, and scat indicating that animals were already beginning to recolonize the area that had been empty for months. I filed a detailed report with the National Park Service, but the information was classified under provisions that prevent disclosure of phenomena that might affect public safety or scientific understanding. The official position was that the research team had encountered equipment malfunctions and observer errors that created false impressions of anomalous conditions. The zone near Gustavus was quietly removed from approved research areas, and access was restricted under environmental protection guidelines that discouraged further investigation. The extinct animal specimens that we had collected were stored in federal facilities where they remain unavailable for independent study. I completed my assignment with the Park Service and accepted a position with a private research organization that was not subject to federal restrictions on scientific investigation. I never returned to the zone near Gustavus, but I continued monitoring reports from other researchers who had encountered similar phenomena in remote locations. The lesson I learned from that experience is that our understanding of time, space, and biological processes is incomplete in ways that become apparent only in places where human activity has not imposed artificial order on natural systems. Remote wilderness areas like those surrounding Gustavus exist under conditions that sometimes reveal aspects of reality that contradict our scientific assumptions. The zone near Gustavus taught me that the boundaries between past and present are not as absolute as we assume, especially in places where geological and environmental conditions create circumstances that our instruments cannot measure accurately. Time itself may be more fluid than our experience suggests, and some locations exist outside the temporal framework that governs most biological processes. If you visit Glacier Bay National Park and encounter areas where wildlife is conspicuously absent despite excellent habitat conditions, consider the possibility that you are observing phenomena that science has not yet learned to explain adequately. Some zones of wilderness exist under rules that are different from those that govern more familiar environments, and approaching them with normal expectations may not prepare you for what you might encounter. The forest near Gustavus appears normal now, supporting healthy populations of contemporary wildlife and showing no signs of the temporal anomalies that once defined the area. But I sometimes wonder whether the zone still exists in a form that our instruments cannot detect, and whether the preserved specimens of extinct animals were evidence of processes that continue to operate beyond our ability to observe or understand them. I am Amanda Foster, and for 7 years I operated the municipal radio station that served as the primary communication link between Nome and the outside world. In a place where winter storms can cut off all transportation for weeks at a time, radio communication becomes literally a lifeline for residents who depend on outside contact for everything from weather information to medical emergencies. The station broadcast on multiple frequencies, providing everything from emergency services coordination to entertainment programming for residents who faced months of darkness during the Arctic winter. My responsibilities included maintaining equipment, coordinating with federal agencies, and monitoring emergency frequencies that connected Nome to search and rescue operations throughout western Alaska. The work required technical expertise and the ability to remain calm during emergencies, when clear communication could mean the difference between life and death for people stranded in remote locations. Nome serves as a regional hub for dozens of smaller communities scattered across the tundra, and the radio station was often the only link those communities had to medical assistance, supply deliveries, and weather information that could save lives. The anomalous transmissions began in early November, when the sea ice was forming, and Nome was entering the period of isolation that defines winter in the Arctic. I was monitoring routine traffic on the emergency frequency when I received a transmission that made no sense according to established communication protocols. The transmission came from a call sign that was not in my database of authorized stations, using a voice that was clearly human but distorted in ways that suggested either equipment problems or atmospheric interference. The speaker identified himself as Thomas Morrison, requesting assistance for a medical emergency at coordinates that placed him approximately 30 miles northeast of Nome. I attempted to establish two-way communication with the caller, but received no response to my transmissions. The voice continued requesting medical assistance, providing details about a heart attack victim who needed immediate evacuation to the hospital in Nome. The information was specific enough that I initiated emergency response procedures, contacting the local medical helicopter service and state troopers who could coordinate a rescue operation. The helicopter crew launched within 20 minutes and proceeded to the coordinates provided by the transmission. They found no sign of human activity at the location, no structures or vehicles that would indicate someone was present and requiring assistance. The terrain was empty tundra with no shelter or equipment that could support human survival in November weather conditions. I continued monitoring the frequency and received the same transmission repeatedly over the following hours. The voice of Thomas Morrison requesting medical assistance for a heart attack victim at coordinates that had proven to be empty wilderness. The transmission quality was consistent, showing none of the degradation that typically occurs with weak or distant signals. I researched the call sign and found it had been assigned to a Nome resident named Thomas Morrison, who had died in 1987. According to the records, Morrison had indeed suffered a fatal heart attack while hunting in the area northeast of Nome, and his body had been recovered from coordinates that matched those being broadcast on the emergency frequency. I reported the situation to my supervisor and suggested that someone might be using Morrison's old call sign and information from historical records to create false emergency calls. But when I provided recordings of the transmissions to local authorities, several longtime Nome residents identified the voice as definitely belonging to Thomas Morrison, despite his death over 30 years earlier. The pattern continued and expanded over the following weeks. I began receiving transmissions from other deceased Nome residents, all requesting assistance for emergencies that had actually occurred years or decades in the past. The voices were clear and recognizable to family members and friends who were still alive, but the emergencies they described had already been resolved through death or successful rescue operations. Margaret Shen, who had frozen to death during the 1985 blizzard, repeatedly requested rescue from her stranded snowmobile. Robert Walsh, who had drowned in the Nome River in 1992, called for help from coordinates that placed him at the exact location where his body had been recovered. Janet Patterson, who had died in a house fire in 1999, transmitted requests for the fire department to respond to her burning home. Each transmission provided accurate information about emergencies that had actually occurred, but the requests for assistance came decades after the actual events had been resolved. The voices were those of the actual victims, speaking as if their emergencies were happening in real time rather than being historical events. I documented all the transmissions and discovered that they followed a specific pattern. The calls came during periods of severe weather, when Nome was isolated from outside contact, and they always involved residents who had died during similar weather conditions in previous years. It was as if the radio frequencies were somehow recording emergency transmissions and playing them back during comparable situations. I consulted with electronics experts and atmospheric scientists to determine whether natural phenomena could explain what I was observing. Radio waves can be affected by atmospheric conditions, and under certain circumstances, old transmissions can be reflected back to their origin points. But the clarity and consistency of the transmissions I was receiving exceeded anything that could be explained through normal atmospheric propagation. More disturbing was the discovery that the transmissions were not limited to historical events. I began receiving calls from residents who were still alive, requesting assistance for emergencies that had not yet occurred. The voices were identical to the living residents, but they described situations that placed them in danger from accidents or medical conditions that had not yet happened. I received a transmission from Jennifer Walsh, a local teacher, requesting assistance for a broken leg sustained while hiking. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Jennifer was teaching at the elementary school. When I contacted the school to verify her location, Jennifer was confirmed to be in her classroom, conducting normal activities. But 3 days later, Jennifer broke her leg while hiking in the exact manner and location described in the radio transmission. Similar predictions occurred with increasing frequency. David Kim transmitted a request for assistance with engine failure on his fishing boat. The call came while Kim's boat was docked at the harbor, undergoing routine maintenance. But the next week, Kim experienced engine failure at the precise coordinates mentioned in the transmission. I realized that the radio frequencies around Nome were somehow accessing information from multiple time periods simultaneously. Past emergencies, present conditions, and future events were all being transmitted on the same frequencies, creating a temporal communication network that defied normal understanding of how radio waves function. I attempted to document this phenomenon systematically, recording all transmissions and correlating them with actual events to establish patterns that might explain what was happening. The correlation was nearly perfect. Historical transmissions matched documented emergency records, and predictive transmissions proved accurate within days or weeks of being received. The breakthrough in understanding came when I realized that Nome itself might exist at a temporal intersection point where different time periods could interact through electromagnetic phenomena. The city's location near the magnetic North Pole, combined with unique atmospheric conditions caused by Arctic weather patterns, might create circumstances where radio transmissions could access information from different temporal frameworks. I contacted researchers at the University of Alaska who specialized in Arctic atmospheric phenomena and electromagnetic research. I provided them with recordings and documentation of the temporal transmissions, requesting scientific evaluation of what I was observing. The research team was initially skeptical, But when they analyzed the recordings, they confirmed that the transmissions were genuine and not the result of equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. The voices were definitively those of the identified individuals, and the information provided in the transmissions matched historical records with impossible accuracy. The team established a monitoring station in Nome and began systematic study of the temporal transmission phenomena. They confirmed that the transmissions occurred during specific atmospheric conditions, particularly during severe winter storms, when electromagnetic activity in the Arctic atmosphere reached peak levels. More significantly, they discovered that the temporal transmissions were not limited to emergency frequencies. All radio communication in the Nome area was affected, creating a communication network that connected different time periods through electromagnetic interference patterns that operated according to physical principles that were not fully understood. The research revealed that residents of Nome were unconsciously participating in temporal communication networks every time they used radio equipment. Phone calls, internet communications, and broadcast transmissions were all being affected by the phenomenon, creating information exchanges between past, present, and future versions of the community. I found evidence that some Nome residents were already aware of this phenomenon and had learned to use it for practical purposes. They would monitor radio frequencies during storms to receive advance warning of emergencies, weather conditions, and other events that affected community safety and survival. The temporal communication network explained several aspects of Nome's history that had never been understood clearly. The community's remarkable survival rate during extreme weather events, their ability to coordinate rescue operations under impossible conditions, and their accuracy in predicting weather patterns that exceeded official forecasting capabilities. I continued operating the radio station for another year while the research team studied the temporal transmission phenomena. During that period, I learned to distinguish between contemporary communications and temporal transmissions, using the information to improve emergency response coordination and weather prediction accuracy. But the psychological impact of constant exposure to communications from different time periods became increasingly difficult to manage. Hearing the voices of deceased residents requesting help for emergencies that could not be resolved created emotional stress that affected my ability to function normally. More disturbing were the transmissions from future versions of myself, describing events and decisions that I had not yet experienced. These communications suggested that my future actions were already determined, and that I was following a path that had been established by temporal forces beyond my control. I decided to leave Nome when I received a transmission from myself describing my own death in a radio station fire that had not yet occurred. The transmission provided specific details about the fire's cause, the failure of safety equipment, and my unsuccessful attempts to escape from the building. I resigned from my position and relocated to Anchorage, but I continued monitoring Nome radio frequencies to track the temporal transmission phenomena. The new radio operator reported similar experiences, with transmissions from deceased residents and predictive communications about future events. The research team published their findings in scientific journals, but the papers were classified under national security provisions that restricted access to information about temporal communication phenomena. The official position was that the Nome transmissions represented atmospheric anomalies that required further study under controlled conditions. Nome continues to function as a regional communication hub, with residents who have learned to live with radio transmissions that connect them to different versions of their community across multiple time periods. The temporal communication network has become part of the community's survival strategy, providing advance warning of dangers and coordination capabilities that help residents survive in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. The lesson I learned in Nome is that communication itself may be more complex than we understand, especially in places where natural conditions create electromagnetic phenomena that operate beyond normal physical parameters. Some communities exist in temporal intersection zones where past, present, and future versions of reality can interact through technologies that were designed for simpler purposes. If you visit Nome and notice that radio communications seem to provide information that should not be available through normal channels, consider the possibility that you are experiencing temporal communication phenomena that connect the community to different versions of itself across time. The voices you hear may be those of residents who are speaking from past emergencies or future events, using radio frequencies that have become pathways between different temporal frameworks. Nome remains a functional Arctic community where radio communication serves essential survival functions, but residents understand that their communication network operates under rules that extend beyond normal electromagnetic principles. They have learned to use temporal information to improve their chances of survival, accepting that communication with different time periods is simply another aspect of life in a place where normal rules do not always apply.
So friends, that was one of Alaska's true chilling stories. Just imagine, living in a place where nights last for months, help is miles away, and sometimes, the silence itself feels alive. These are not just stories, they are real experiences of people who went through unimaginable fear. If you felt the chills tonight, then don't forget to subscribe to Dreadory. Your support means everything. It's what keeps me going and helps me bring you more true horror stories every single day. And remember, every night has its own secrets. And tomorrow I'll be back with another tale from the darkness. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and good night.